It's been a while since I've had the opportunity to do one of these, and I'm going to try to keep it very brief. I'm going to talk a little bit about communism and America's fake hatred towards communism. Why is it that America hates communism? When you look at, for example, people often blame socialism for what took down countries like Venezuela and Cuba. Now, if you understand the history of what was going on prior to, for example, when Hugo Chavez in Venezuela became president, and when you look at, for example, when Fidel Castro came into power in Cuba, why did these men come into power during that time period? It was because of American colonialism in those countries. And so when America had, for example, like ExxonMobil and, I forget the name of the other one, Chevron. Chevron had big production of oil in their country. And so America was basically stealing a lot of the oil, and the money was coming out of those countries, and then of course lining the pockets of American corporations. And they weren't hiring the local people, they were hiring their own people. And so this is the exact same thing that America did in what's it called, in Cuba, where they had these pockets of this with the banana trade and with sugarcane in Cuba. And so Americans basically lived in these countries. So you had huge colonies of Americans that lived in Cuba and that lived in Venezuela. And so they basically hired their own people. And so the people were upset. This is the same thing that is going on right now in Panama. And I talked about this, where you had that ex-American lawyer who shot a Panamanian that was protesting, where they kind of blocked the highway and they weren't letting people pass. And I had stated that the reason that you see like the fake protests that go on in Western countries that annoy people, they're like, can these people get a job? They sit there and throw paint at painting. They'll sit there and they'll glue their hand, or they'll block the highway. And this is to annoy Americans, so that when it happens in other countries, Americans will associate the same sort of leftism with those protests. And it's to stop you from looking any further into what's going on. And so just like what's going on in Panama, where between a cooperation with the Canadian government, they're going in, ruining the environment, and they're pulling out cobalt. And the people of Panama voted no for the president to go in and make this deal. And the people said no. And so this was why the people were protesting. And so this exact same thing was happening in Cuba, and it was happening in Venezuela. And so Chavez comes into power, and then he starts seizing the means of production, right? This was the same thing that happened in Mexico, when the Mexican government seized the American corporations that were there for the exact same reason. They went into these countries, they take their natural resources, they hire their own people, and so all the wealth leaves the country, and so does the natural resources, and very little money is shared with the countries and with the people. So you're basically putting your own corporation. This is what colonialism looks like. Now, of course, later, when the people revolt, to quiet the revolutions, you use imperialism, where you buy off the politicians, you put in a puppet, like what you see in Ukraine, what you see in many countries in Africa, where and this is basically what Maduro is. Maduro is a puppet of the United States, and America sends millions and hundreds of millions of dollars and food aid and aid for healthcare, infrastructure. It's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every single year, and none of that money gets to the people. It overwhelmingly goes to keep men like Maduro in power, so that the oil and whatever natural resources that Venezuela has, the people can't take advantage of it and start capitalism all over again within the country. This is why, as much as America says, we're going to go bring democracy to these nations, if they really love democracy, why wouldn't they bring it to Venezuela? Why wouldn't they bring it to Cuba? Because the reason being, the reason these countries collapsed is because of communism. And so communism is where the people get fed up and they start a revolution, and you get a revolution from the bottom up. And this is why America hates communism, because it overthrows those who are currently in power, and then you just basically have, a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled by somebody else. And so naturally, if you're in power, if you're very wealthy, if you got a big business, if you're a local politician and you're living well, you're not going to want a communist revolution in your country. And this is why America pretends to hate communism while, of course, having socialism within their own country. Eventually, we will get there. Now this is why the American government hates communism, because they can go into these nations, rob them of their resources, rob them of their natural resources, take their oil, take their cobalt, take their sugar cane, whatever it is. And then when the people revolt, they'll say, oh, the country collapsed because of socialism. They'll blame it on socialism. When the reality is, if this was the case, when the people revolted in Cuba, they would have loved it. Great, the people were going for democracy, right? This is what they claim, that we love democracy. And so the people voted for, they loved Chavez. They loved Castro, right? The problem is then America sanctions these nations, and they say, well, you can't trade with these nations. And so they become very limited, and eventually what you get is the poverty that is associated. Now all these nations aren't going to trade. They can't trade with Venezuela. They can't trade with Cuba. And so naturally, because the people have been stripped of their wealth, they've been stripped of their manufacturing, because now these countries get pushed out, the businesses get pushed out, and because the people don't know and are not allowed to trade, because the American government doesn't allow other countries to trade with Cuba or to trade with Venezuela. This is how they keep them poor. And then, of course, they send aid, right? We send aid to these countries, and the purpose of sending them aid is to keep them poor, just like you see in Africa. This is why America sends so much food aid to Africa, because they don't want the farmers to start trading, to start producing food and then selling that food and then starting to grow their economy. The purpose of welfare is to keep you dependent, whether it's food aid, whether it's some form of financial aid, whether it's aid for whatever it is. The overwhelming purpose is to keep you poor. That's the purpose, and keep you dependent. And so when you look at many of these countries, they blame it on socialism. You got socialism right here. You got socialized healthcare, socialized retirement. You got too big to fail corporations. You got pension plans. These are all forms of socialism. You have the pseudo retirement from Social Security insurance, Medicare, Medicaid. These are all the loans from, for going to school, for real estate. These are all forms of socialism. And the purpose of socialism, of course, is to devalue the currency and to then keep the people dependent. And of course, the only way that you can do this is through centralized banking. The purpose of centralized banking is to introduce socialism to the country. And so it doesn't matter what country you go to, because every country is a socialist nation that has a central bank. And so it doesn't matter if the dollar fails, because all countries are socialist nations. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of countries operate under socialism, and socialism has spread globally. Eventually, like the Bible states, you get the one world government. You get the one world government as socialism collapses. What you end up with is straight communism, just outright communism, as the resources start to dwindle, and the strong who pushed and fought for the revolution, they don't fight in a revolution to become the common man. They don't have this idyllic sort of mentality that they're going to be just as poor as you. It's like, well, we didn't risk our life and limb to be the commoners. And so what happens is they eventually, because they were the ones who killed the ones who were in charge before, now the people who are too afraid to pick up, their weapons and fight the previous oppressors are not going to fight their new oppressors either. So this is why communism always fails. This is why communism always fails, because it never actually really introduces a true system of merit-based, true capitalism, where the people rise and fall based off of their own means. They seize the means of productions completely, and then the people then become the new poor, subjected to the new class of their owners, which are the people who previously overthrew the last owners. And this is why communism fails no matter where it goes. It's just because it's the natural tendency, as Jesus had stated when he talked about the rulers of nations, they tend to lord it over the people. And of course, Jesus said, this is not the way it should be with you. And so this will continue to play out time and time again. No matter where you go, every single country will go through this same cycle, because the tendency of people is to have power over those, and the tendency of the weak is to enslave themselves to the strong. And eventually they'll take you along with them. This is what you see in the United States. You have a lot of people that don't want to be personally responsible for themselves, and so they advocate for a system of socialism. They advocate for more laws, more rules, more regulations, because they can't rule themselves, and so they want the government to rule them. And it is what it is. This isn't going to change. Anyway, getting a little long-winded. I'm going to leave it here. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.